Senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that Jonathan McKernan, a detailee on the Banking Committee, be given floor privileges throughout the remainder of this Congress.
Without objection.
Winston Churchill said, quote, "We sleep safely at night because rough men stand ready to visit violence on those who would harm us." The men and women of the United States Armed Forces sign up for no small task. They join to serve their country, not for money, not for fame, not because it's glamorous in any way. They sign up because they understand that Winston Churchill was right, that the blessings of a free society are possible only if there are those willing to put the safety and well-being of their country ahead of their own safety and ahead of their own lives when necessary. That solemn, sacred responsibility, the responsibility that every member of our armed forces is committed so nobly to upholding, deserves our utmost respect. Regrettably, on August 9th of 2021, the Secretary of Defense issued a message to the force indicating his intent to require COVID-19 vaccination for all service members. This mandate went into effect on August 24th, 2021. There were a lot of promises made at the time, promises suggesting that individual needs would be taken into account, individual needs including good faith, sincerely held religious beliefs that might make it impossible for a service member to be vaccinated without violating his or her sincerely held convictions. Unfortunately, it hasn't really panned out that way, as I'll explain in a moment. But in a nutshell, since the implementation of this vaccine mandate over almost the last year and a half, the United States military has dismissed 8,200 service members for declining to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. Mr. President, that's over 8,000, more than 8,200 individuals. And it's not just the individuals themselves. Many, if not most of these individuals themselves are mothers or fathers. They've got mouths to feed, families to care for, all of whom are placed in a really unfair position as a result of this mandate. Serving our country shouldn't require you to surrender your fundamental right to make medical decisions that are right for you, no matter the reason. And yet that's precisely what the Department of Defense continues to do. My office has received hundreds of accounts from brave members of our armed forces detailing the hardships and the retaliation they've experienced for declining to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. One first sergeant in the Air Force writes, quote, "I was involuntarily separated and my enlistment was curtailed. I was a first sergeant with the U.S. Air Force Reserves. At the time the COVID mandate was put into place, I did everything I could to be allowed to continue to serve my country. I filed my religious AR, and when it got denied, I also filed an appeal, and that got denied." She goes on, "All I wanted to do was to continue to take care of the members of my squadron and continue to serve this great country." Likewise, a Marine officer writes, quote, "My family was forced to move on very short notice back to the U.S. from Okinawa due to the loss of a job and the threat of travel restriction. If we remained unvaccinated, many are far worse off than me." Another lieutenant colonel with the Marine Corps Reserve was placed on inactive status with no warning or notice that this would happen. And in the process, lost the TRICARE health insurance that his family relies on to provide expensive medical supplies for his special needs daughter, even though his appeal for a religious exemption was and remains still today pending. It seems in this and other circumstances, the Department of Defense has issued something of a pocket veto, not acting on these requests for an exemption, but instead refusing to act and therefore leaving the service member with few options. This person writes, quote, "My entire family was, without notice or warning, dropped from TRICARE, left scrambling to find health insurance." Mr. President, these brave men and women represent just a tiny fraction of the service members who have reached out to my office. Many are in desperation. They're pleading for someone to recognize the injustice they're experiencing. They deserve better. And we owe them more than this. So as we consider this year's National Defense Authorization Act, the blueprint for the defense budget that directs policy for our military, we should adopt a simple amendment that would, 1, immediately repeal the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. 2, prohibit the DoD from replacing the current COVID-19 vaccine mandate with a similar mandate absent express congressional approval. 3, provide remedies for any service member negatively impacted by the mandate, including the right to reinstatement if desired and to petition for a change in status if they received a negative discharge based on whether or not they were vaccinated, correcting for any loss of rank, pay, or retirement benefits. And 4, require the DoD to make every effort to retain unvaccinated members. Look, we of course can't take back the hardship that the military vaccine mandate has inflicted on countless service members. We can't do that. That's in the past. But there are some things we can do. By adopting this amendment, we could recognize an injustice and take steps to restore the affected brave men and women who deserve our best. We owe them that, and we owe them so much more. And so I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and stand with those who themselves stand ready to visit violence on those who would harm us. It is the right thing to do. And Mr. President, while we're on the topic of actions taken by the Department of Defense that don't show adequate and appropriate and necessary respect for those who stand in harm's way to protect us and defend us, I want to tell you the story of a brave young man, a U.S. Navy lieutenant named Ridge Alconus. Mr. President, Ridge Alconus is one of the best and the brightest that our Navy has to offer, that America has to offer. A graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, a decorated officer who served his country well, who goes above and beyond the call of duty by every account that I can find or that I have access to. Lieutenant Alconus, who is also the father of 3 young children and the devoted husband to his wife, Brittany, sits today languishing in a Japanese prison. You may ask, what has he done? What put him there? Why is he in prison in Japan? Did he steal something? Did he harm someone? No, none of the above. No, Mr. President, at the end of May 29th of 2021, Lieutenant Alconus and his wife Brittany along with their 3 children, decided to take a brief road trip to go see Mount Fuji. And while descending from Mount Fuji, he suffered a most unfortunate, most unforeseen, and unforeseeable medical emergency, one that caused him to lose consciousness while driving. His young daughter, seeing that he had lost consciousness, tried to wake him up. She kicked the seat, she yelled, she did everything she could to wake him up, and he didn't wake up. You see, he wasn't asleep. He lost consciousness. He suffered from a rare medical condition that he didn't know he had, he couldn't have known that he had this medical condition. It caused him to lose consciousness at that moment. Tragically, while he was unconscious, the car he was driving was involved in an accident, one that took the lives of 2 Japanese nationals. My heart breaks for them, for the family members of these individuals whose lives were lost on May 29th, 2021 in Japan. I know that Lieutenant Alconus, with whom I've spoken, as I've visited him in prison in Japan, his heart breaks for them as well. Our entire country extends our thoughts, our prayers, and our well wishes to the family members of those victims. But this was not a criminal act, Mr. President. This was a medical emergency, one that resulted in a tragedy. And I'm so sad that it did. And no one is more sad about this than Lieutenant Alconus and his family. You see, in Japan, they have a different system than ours. In the United States, this wouldn't result in someone going to prison. This wouldn't result in criminal charges of any kind. This would be regarded for what it is, which is a tragedy resulting from a medical emergency, an accident that wasn't foreseen or foreseeable. We wouldn't send someone to prison for that here in the United States. We understand that different countries have different systems of law, and we do our very best to respect the laws of other countries. But that's why he's in prison today. But my purpose in raising this today is to talk about how our country handled it, not about how Japan handled it. We can talk about that perhaps on another day, but today I want to talk about how the United States military is handling this tragedy. When a U.S. military officer or enlisted person isn't able to be present for duty, he or she will stop getting paid. Will stop getting paid if they're absent from their work. It's not surprising. Pretty much any job works that way. And like most jobs, if you're absent from your work, your employer can make a decision about whether the absence was unavoidable and should therefore be excused. An employer in the private sector might, for example, decide to continue to pay someone for a period of time if the circumstances warrant it. They might warrant it, particularly if the absence was brought about as a result of the conditions in which the person was working on the job. For example, imagine you were running a business and you had an employee who you assigned to work somewhere in a foreign country for a period of time, and something like this happened. I would imagine that many, if not most, if not all, sane employers would do everything they possibly could to take care of the family and of that particular employee and that employee's family if something like this happened in a country where they were present only as a result of their work assignment. And in fact, there is a statute that deals with this very thing for employees of the Department of Defense. That statute is codified at 37 U.S.C. Section 503. Here's what it says, Mr. President. Quote, a member of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force, Coast Guard, or National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration who is absent without leave or over leave forfeits all pay and allowances for the period of that absence unless it is excused as unavoidable. Unless it is excused as unavoidable. It's exactly what the Department of Defense should do right now, Mr. President, is excuse as unavoidable Lieutenant Alconus's absence. It seems to me that if ever there were an instance perfectly tailored for this statute, if ever there were an absence that needed to be excused as unavoidable, it's that of Lieutenant Ridge Alconus. So with that in mind, and with the needs of his wife, Brittany, and their 3 young children who are still in Japan, Lieutenant Alconus filed the paperwork for an exception to policy with the Department of Defense. Now, that application was filed many, many months ago. And we now find ourselves in a situation in which that application has not been granted. They filed this, I believe, back in June. It was transferred from one office to another in July. It was transferred, sent over to the office of the Undersecretary of the Department of Defense a few months later. It still hasn't been acted on formally. I've spoken with more officials within the Department of Defense than I can. It was transferred from one office to another in July. It was transferred, sent over to the office of the Undersecretary of the Department of Defense a few months later. It still hasn't been acted on formally. I've spoken with more officials within the Department of Defense than I can even count at this moment. I've been on this pattern of making phone calls since just a few weeks after this was filed in June. I've spoken with officials within the Office of the Secretary of the Navy, including the Secretary himself. I've spoken to Undersecretary Cisneros. I've spoken even to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and I've appreciated their willingness to take my phone calls. And they still haven't acted. They still haven't granted those. Still hasn't happened. Now, keep in mind, this has been in the Office of the Secretary of Defense since September 3rd. So we're going on 3.5 months since that was forwarded, and they still haven't acted. Now, I finally spoke with Undersecretary Cisneros. He was one of the last people I got through to. It took me 3 weeks to get through to the Undersecretary. 3 weeks of calling. I finally got through to him. And during that phone call, I appreciated the fact that he finally took it. He assured me that whatever decision was made, it would be a decision that was made by the appropriate personnel, and that it would be in the best, whatever was in the best interests of the Department of Defense. I told him at the time I believed that what was best for the Alconus family would itself be what was in the best interests of the Department of Defense. You see, Mr. President, because there are a lot of problems that our Department of Defense has right now. recruiting is down, morale is down, threats to our national security are up. There are more demands on our military men and women than ever before. Why would you want to take one of your best and your brightest, one of your smartest, one of these people who I've talked to so many people who have worked with him in his chain of command, who have described him as the kind of guy who will do something that needs to be done even before anyone else realizes it needs to be done. He'll go out on his own and proactively take steps to improve himself, to improve others around him. He's exactly what the Navy, what the Department of Defense, and what the United States of America needs. So why? When you put him in a vulnerable position, you send him to Japan. And look, I don't understand Japan's laws. They're very different than our own. But they're Japan. It's their country. Those are their laws. It's what they do. We may not, within the United States government, be able to solve that particular issue. I wish we could. I hope we can at some point. Those are conversations for a different day. But for today, we can deal with this. We can take care of this family. So let's go back to November 2nd. So I had that conversation with Secretary Cisneros. I told Undersecretary Cisneros that it was imperative that this be acted upon quickly because Ridge Alconus's leave was going to be running out. You see, since he was actually put in prison in July of this year, it took, between the accident that occurred the end of May 2021, the time the criminal charges were filed and completed, it wasn't until July that he actually reported to prison. And since July, Lieutenant Alconus and his wife Brittany and their 3 children have been relying on the fact that he had accumulated leave accumulated over the years that have lasted him this long. And I told Undersecretary Cisneros on November 2nd, it's really important that this be acted upon quickly because the Alconuses need this. They need this right away. They need the certainty of it. They need to be able to plan their lives. I then started seeking a call with Secretary Austin, the Secretary of Defense. It took me 3 weeks to get that one scheduled. 3 weeks. Finally spoke to him on November 29th. Secretary Austin callously informed me that day that the request for the exception to policy would not be granted. I asked him why. He believed that it wasn't appropriate for the department to do that. It was a private conversation, so I'm not going to go into all the details of it there. But I asked him at that moment, if that's your decision, will you at least formalize it and put it out so that it's in public, so that we can discuss it, so that its relative merits can be addressed, so that we as a Congress can figure out, once on public notice, of what the action was and why it was taken, how we can decide how best to address it. If somehow, beyond my ability to comprehend as a lawyer and as a United States Senator, but if somehow the statutory text of 37 U.S.C. Section 503, if it contains something saying you may not grant an exception to policy in this circumstance, similar to that of Lieutenant Alconus, then we could at least be on notice of that so that we as a Congress could figure out how to change the law so that it doesn't take that into account. I have yet to tell this story to a single member of the United States Congress, Democrat or Republican, House or Senate, who isn't moved by this story and who doesn't conclude, well, of course, this is a no-brainer. Of course we should take care of him and his family. Of course they should be granted an exception to policy. But to do that, Mr. President, we have to be able to have the notice of what their decision is, the actual decision itself, and why it came about. I asked him when that would be coming, and he said, soon. And I said, how soon? Reminding him that we're just weeks away. In fact, Mr. President, we are now less than 2 weeks away before Lieutenant Alconus's leave runs out, and before his wife Brittany and their 3 children, who are still in Japan, will have no source of income. These are 3 very young children. The older kids are homeschooled by Brittany Alconus. They're in Japan, not a cheap place to live, and their income stream is about to run out. Now, the casual, calloused observer might respond by saying, okay, well, then she can just go back to the United States. Okay, and then what? Go back to the United States. You know what that means? That would mean that they don't ever get to see their husband and their father. In fact, because of the way the rules work in Japan, they can't even talk to him on the phone. There would be no interaction with Lieutenant Alconus by his wife and their 3 children if they just left. So leaving is a problem. It still doesn't solve the problem of income. This very young stay-at-home mom who homeschools their children, what is she supposed to do? So she's got this Hobson's choice, this absolutely awful dilemma. Rather than the prisoner's dilemma, we'll call it the prisoner's wife's dilemma. This is inexcusable. The fact that they won't excuse as unavoidable Lieutenant Alconus's absence is itself inexcusable, and we must act. It's more difficult for us to act because the Department of Defense hasn't even had the decency to issue a public pronouncement for this. I find this reprehensible. Earlier today, in fact, just an hour or 2 ago, Mrs. Brittany Alconus sent out a series of tweets, and one of them said the following. She said, in 13 days, our pay and benefits will be turned off. I won't be able to support our children or Ridge, that is Lieutenant Alconus, and I clearly won't be able to count on the U.S. Navy to do so either. This is not a way to treat those who stand in harm's way so that we can live and be safe and be free. This isn't a way to treat anyone. None of us would treat our employees that way. I don't know anyone who would. So, on top of everything else, it's not just the fact that they've now stated that they're going to deny it, it's that they waited so long to do so, and that they still haven't had the decency to say so in public. And then, on top of all of that, they're going to have her kicked to the curb at Christmas time in a foreign land. This is just disgraceful. Look, I get it. I know the Department of Defense is really big. I know that the burdens faced by Secretary Austin, Undersecretary Cisneros, and so many others that I've spoken to and those that I haven't spoken to within the Department of Defense, I know that they're immense. I'm grateful to them and for the service they provide to our great country. I'm grateful that they have taken time to examine this issue. They've reached the wrong conclusion and they've done it in the wrong way. Fortunately, Mr. President, there's still time. And time is short, but there's still time for them to make right that which is wrong. They can still take care of Brittany Alconus and the 3 children of Ridge and Brittany Alconus. They can still do that. I urge them to do so. If they don't do it, we will have no choice as a Congress but to act. The Department of Defense may or may not like whatever legislation we put in place in order to do it, but it'll happen. It's hard for it to happen, perhaps impossible for it to happen, until they issue their actual decision so that we know what it is that we're correcting. They should at least have the decency to do that. But the United States must not allow this family to be treated this way. In no other circumstance that I can find has anyone going back many, many decades serving for the United States Armed Forces in Japan or any other place that I'm aware of been placed in prison as a result of a medical emergency. So this truly is exceptional, and that's what makes the exception to policy so meritorious and so worthy. He did nothing wrong. This was not foreseeable. It was not avoidable. He was in Japan only because he was assigned to serve in Japan, where he has served faithfully. We must correct this wrong. And I'll be back to the Senate floor as often as it takes. Once we have the actual decision in hand, I'll know what legislation to push for. I'll know what office to reconfigure, what statutory language to strip out or add. They need to issue that right away. But even better, they need to issue their decision not to deny, but to grant the exception to policy for Lieutenant Ridge Alconus. The Alconus family and the United States itself deserves nothing less. Thank you, Mr. President.